Submission Radio here, post-fight at UFC 234, brought to you by Musashi. You've seen the lounge, the mahogany lounge, but now welcome to the Submission Radio couch, and what a couch it is. We have legends such as John Morgan, Oscar Willis, and of course, me and Casper here in Melbourne after a very interesting event. A pay-per-view here in Australia that lost one of its biggest fights before things even got on their way. Guys, let's kick it off with John. I mean, you've been to some of the biggest pay-per-views around the world. What did you make of a card that already had a few issues to begin with, losing one of its main fights before things got on their way?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I know UFC President Dana White got a little upset when he was asked if the card was top-heavy. I mean, the card was top-heavy, but I don't expect him to admit that. I mean, he's a promoter. He's supposed to make the product appear just as fantastic as it is. And there were some good fights, but it was just that star power that was missing. But it was incredible, right? We had these two amazing fights, and then to lose one, to have Robert Whittaker out, to scratch that fight, to elevate the main event, and for it to only be 3 rounds. It's just a lot of things conspired for this to feel like not a massive event. I mean, it felt a lot like a fight night card, basically, like a fight night with just a really sweet main event. But I will say, credit to your countrymen and women, man. They showed up. The atmosphere, as we expected, was incredible in Rod Laver, and it was still a packed house, and it was still a fun night. So, yeah. It is kind of wild when you look back on paper and think this was a pay-per-view card. But listen, I mean, the next one looks absolutely stacked in Las Vegas, so they'll make it up to us.
The funny thing is, John, that you were here in this very same arena, Rod Laver, when Robert Whittaker fought Derek Brunson. Originally, it was supposed to be Luke Rockhold and Jacare in the main event, and then it ended up being the Robert Whittaker show, and that was great for him. And kind of a similar thing happened here, where Israel and Anderson got bumped up. It kind of ended up being the Israel show. But before we even get to that, sort of earlier in the night, Kelvin Gastelum came in the back. He did a scrum. He had a belt. He had Henry Cejudo's belt. By the way, poor Oscar Willis flying all the way from Vegas just to see Robert Whittaker from the Mac Life convincing them it's going to be a great pay-per-view, it's going to be a big show, and then Rob pulls out. But what did you think of the way Kelvin handled himself, sort of played the part, I guess playing the gimmick? We asked him about the belt, whose belt is it? Who gave you that belt? Did the UFC give it to you? And he was sort of like, look, I earned this. This is my belt.
Yeah, so I think before the event started, we all said, wow, Kelvin could be the one to really lose here. If Israel comes out, he could get the title shot. If Anderson wins, he'd get the title shot, and Kelvin could be sort of forgotten. So John and I were saying before the event, how is he going to handle this? I think with the cards he's been dealt, the best way he could have. Yeah, we've seen the guy with the belt that's not really his belt a few times now, and maybe it's ironic he got it off Cejudo, who's known for being a little bit cringe sometimes too. But I think actually Kelvin coming in, making a statement, like, no, don't. I'm not being overlooked here. I thought it was the best way to handle it. And, yeah, good move by him.
And the interesting thing here is, before we break down a couple of the fights from the card, what is the situation that Kelvin Gastelum is in? And as I try and look through the couch here, because there's some handsome faces looking back, what is going to happen to him? Because you have a guy like Israel who's so marketable, who just won this fight with Anderson Silva, and he was supposed to get the next shot. And then here you are, you have Kelvin Gastelum, of course, Robert Whittaker. Hernia apparently doesn't take that long to recover from. John, what do you make of this? In a perfect world, if you were booking this, how would you go about what happens to Kelvin next, and what happens to Israel next, and what the deal is with Rob?
Well, it completely depends on what point of view you're looking at, right? Morally, you should give Kelvin Gastelum another title shot, right? I mean, it's not his fault this thing fell apart, but, in the post-fight press conference when I asked Dana White, hey, does this mean that Kelvin Gastelum is next? Does it mean he's, whatever happens? Because, what if it does take longer for Rob to recover, and then maybe you want to do an interim title or something along those lines? Would Kelvin Gastelum be involved? And, he didn't rule it out. But he sure didn't say, oh, absolutely. Kelvin's got his spot. He said, well, we got to see things play out. We'll make our decision from that point of view. So, listen, I think it's very possible that Israel Adesanya might just slide past him. Israel Adesanya came back after his win and said, I'm the #1 contender. That's what you need to know about. Also said, hey, I want to find out where those pay-per-view points are going, because nobody was getting pay-per-view points in the main event. Don't leave that money on the table. But, yeah, to get back to your original question, listen, I think there's a very real possibility that if you're doing this from the most marketable way possible, if that's your concern, business, you put Israel Adesanya in a title shot. I mean, we saw it all week long. Even though the main event was the main event, the co-main event was the one that everybody was most interested in. That's the one that the buzz was around. Why not go with the hot hand? So as you know, Oscar said, I am glad, even if the gimmick was a little cheesy by Kelvin Gastelum, you got to do something, man. You got to come in and do something to keep people talking about your name and to stake your claim. So, but I think there's a very real possibility that Kelvin Gastelum gets kind of passed over here.
Especially when you consider the fact that before Gastelum did get the title shot, it was sort of a toss-up between him and Chris Weidman. They were both arguing and pleading their cases. And then you got Israel, who is on a much higher win streak, technically, than Kelvin Gastelum. I could definitely see it happening. I want to hear from both of you guys, because at this point you've covered a ton of massive events, a ton of huge pay-per-views. What did it feel like to you sort of in the arena between Israel and Anderson? Because from where I'm sitting, and obviously Dennis and I have covered a lot of McGregor events and big events as well, it had that big-time event feel.
Absolutely, and actually, I think if everyone's going to take anything away from this pay-per-view and say, oh, it was top-heavy, it didn't really matter by the time the event was over, because Anderson Silva versus Israel Adesanya had that energy of a big fight. It's almost like everyone forgot about the other stuff. This was that good. And as far as crowd reaction, I thought it was the perfect place to hold it. Every time Anderson dodged a kick in the way Israel sometimes did it, the crowd would go crazy and clap. There was like literally applause breaks for these guys, and to be in there, to feel that energy, it was actually so fun. You know, it was tense. It could have felt like it could have ended at any time, but just like everyone in there was just a fan of both guys, a fan of their moves, and just wanted to see the highlight reel that we actually got to see.
I just want to say that I'm not saying the entire event had that feel, but just the main event, everyone was so heavily invested in this whole young fighter, you know, eating the old line essentially.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. I think Oscar hit it on the head, that people were fans of both. So I think that's what was cool about it, is that, yes, of course, this is more or less Adesanya's backyard, so you had the home, you know, crowd there cheering for it, but at the same time, Anderson Silva, you know, potentially the greatest of all time, much beloved figure, done all these accomplishments. So he was getting that respect too. So it wasn't one-sided. I think that's what kind of added to the feel, is that it wasn't all just one-sided. It was back and forth.
Just quickly before you go, Dennis, I want to say one thing that shocked me when Anderson came out. I understand everybody cheered when Israel came out. The crowd started booing. I was shocked.
I wasn't shocked at all, man.
You weren't?
Look, yeah, for weeks now, and even if you guys would listen to Aaron Bronste's podcast from this week, I've been talking about the fact that in Australia, people have this idea that we go for whoever's sort of from around the area, sort of like Ireland and UK, but we love an international talent down here, you know, and a lot of times when the UFC just put together these cards with just local talent, fans will often be like, man, you know, what is going on? Where's the international guys? Where are the big stars? And I feel like for Anderson, for fans, Israel was a big part of this whole thing selling out, but when they saw it was Anderson Silva, that was like the perfect combination there. I feel like a lot of fans there were there to see Anderson Silva, and imagine if it was like Israel Adesanya versus Jacare, for example. You know, still a great fight, but it wouldn't be the same draw. So for me, I feel like, especially when Rob was gone from the card, Anderson Silva was the guy that sort of kept everybody coming back. But the booing was a little bit weird, but I wasn't surprised that they were cheering for Anderson, because I thought, man, these guys love Anderson. It just seems like everybody was there for him. I was just really, though, when just looking at the fight itself, Anderson walking out in Rod Laver Arena, you know, the way the arena's built for the tennis and the way the sound just comes out of there. It was a really historic moment for Australian sports, for people that were down here. I know that, you know, Rob was off the card. I know the card may have had some issues, but I think just that moment alone, I feel like a lot of ticket goers actually got their money's worth just for experiencing that moment. But speaking of the fight, I mean,
just quickly on that Anderson thing, I can't tell you how many times we've joked like, hey, it'd be great if Anderson came to Australia and it was met with a scoff like, oh yeah, Anderson. Like how in what scenario would that happen? So it's pretty crazy seeing him here.
It was unbelievable that he was walking through, especially at this stage in his career. And watching him fight, I mean, it was interesting. In the first sort of round, you really saw that, okay, this is a guy coming back from a layoff. This is a guy fighting somebody who's a fast guy, a great stand-up artist, a guy with some great fakes. And he looked a little bit slow to begin with, but when you got into that second round, I'll tell you what, guys, for a moment there, I was like, man, how is this guy looking the way that he's looking at 43 years old? All in all, I thought it was a great fight. He was in his prime when it came to mental warfare, mind games, trying to get Israel to do his thing in the cage. All in all, I thought it was a good fight, but I think the only thing that kind of let people down was that and I think this hit me as well when I was watching it. Oh yeah, it's a 3-round fight. You know what I mean? And there's not going to be a conclusion to this one. John, what did you think of the fight and how it played out?
That's exactly it. So, I've seen feedback both ways, right? Like some people saying they love the fight, some people saying they hated the fight. I liked the fight, but it did leave me feeling a little bit empty. So that's why I hesitate to be like, yes, it was a classic. Yes, it was great. I mean, just watching, it was so stressful watching the tactics between the two of them. And yes, I know that both of them this week have kind of shunned the idea that they're copies of each other, but come on. I mean, it's the way they move. I mean, like, they kind of are, So just seeing that play out, seeing like some of the angles that Adesanya would take when Anderson was trying to cut him off, and just little moves here, little feints and little traps that each of them were setting. I mean, that stuff was all crazy because you were waiting for it to erupt. It never did erupt full on. I mean, we did see Anderson get touched up probably more than we've ever seen him get, the busted up eye. So it left me feeling a little bit empty because I wanted those last 2 rounds. I felt like it was building to that crescendo, and then it was like, oh yeah, we're done. Sorry, let's go to the judges' cards. But I thought the fight was good. I think Anderson looked a lot better than I think he could have. I thought it could have, it could have been bad. Like, that's what I didn't want to see. It was like, just him get laid out and starched. I mean, that would have been hard to watch. The older guy, the young guy, it would have been tough. But I thought, Anderson won the second round. So, I mean, he was definitely competitive. And overall, I think he showed that, he's still got something left, even in his advanced stage.
Do you guys think also, going into this fight, obviously he was very heartfelt, emotional, kind, and in a lot of ways sort of won the fans over during fight week as well. In a lot of ways, and it was effective, the way that he behaved, the things that he did in this fight week. It paid off with the sense that, Israel was emotional at the weigh-ins. And the fans, it feels like the fans were the ones who were caught up in this as well because, man, this is an older guy. He was crying yesterday. We want to see him do well. And that was almost an advantage through the fight as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think throughout this week, Anderson's sort of been a bit, he likes to play games. He's almost portrayed this, like, it felt like a goodbye at the own workouts, like, oh, I'm too tired, I'm too old, but he carried on, and when he got in there, like John said, they are similar, except I felt like Israel looks like just the updated version, right? Anderson looks like he's the older school guy, and that to me was part of this captivating thing. And back to your point, Dennis, that, throughout that, I think maybe part of the booze came from that too. Like, Anderson's been playing this, like, hey, I'm Uncle Anderson, I'm back here, just, I want to fight and get back out
Speaking
there.
very good English down here, no translators needed.
Yeah. And that, for Melbourne, that's a talent in itself. But, he was great. I really think he knows where he's at. He's like a statesman now in this sport, right? He's like the older guy. He's like, in fact, what happened tonight, it's amazing how often this works out for the UFC. It was the best possible outcome. He didn't get viciously knocked out, and he did literally just go, right, here's the younger guy, he is very good, and he did pass the torch. That's his role, and I think this week he played it perfectly.
I found it fascinating seeing Israel dealing with those mind games as well, because he from the onset was like, look, I know Anderson, I've been studying for a long time, I'm prepared for those mind games. And he spoke to us about how Anderson kind of lulls you, almost pretends to be your friend, like, hey, does little things, subtle things, touches you on the elbow, and by the time fight time comes around, he switches to this killer, the gear. And then you saw at the weigh-ins where Anderson was crying, Israel started crying, and then he was crying in the back. He spoke to the press about it, and you think, man, is he lulling Israel? And even about how Israel was saying how I'm going to remind you guys how dangerous Anderson is. And you can see, especially in the second round, Israel had a lot of respect for Anderson. This wasn't a case where, oh, old Anderson, he's going to go out there and get destroyed. It was a competitive fight, essentially, the entire time. What do you think about this, I guess, power stance that Israel's taken where, Dominic Cruz is saying, hey, maybe Jacare fight would make sense, and Israel's like, I don't need, essentially, to fight Jacare. I've earned the time to sort of take it off, and it's almost like, public negotiating in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's right. I mean, to be honest, maybe if you look at his resume, you could say, well, he doesn't have the top 5 middleweight that he needs to beat to get the title shot, but look, he's got a rocket on his back. He's a superstar in the making. We all see it. Sometimes they get pushed too far, like Darren Till against Tyron Woodley. It felt like a similar sort of thing, and it didn't work out. But I really think Israel is a special talent. Not to disrespect Darren Till, he's very good too. But I really think if they put him in a title fight tomorrow, no one's blinking. And bringing Kelvin back into this, I don't really think many people are going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe they've done this to Kelvin. I think people would like to see Adesanya Whitaker. We talk about big fight feel tonight. There's a big fight feel around that fight.
That would be absolutely huge. And I guess speaking about Anderson, we're sort of in the dark here in the sense that we don't know what is going to be next for him. He was talking about Nick Diaz possibly in Brazil. Conor McGregor's calling him out. Israel Adesanya suggesting a Cannonier fight, which I'm like, you must really hate Anderson Silva if you're suggesting that. And he needed a minute to think about it, so there's no excuses with that one.
Hey, man, that was the funniest recommendation ever. I was like, what? I'm back there in the back, like, editing video while the camera's rolling. I had to look up. I'm like, did he say what I thought he said, Cannonier?
What do you guys think, John? If you were sort of the matchmaker here, and it would look like possibly one of Anderson Silva's last fight, if not his last fight, would be in Brazil. Who makes sense?
To be honest with you, I like the Nick Diaz fight. The thing is, we want something that's going to be interesting. I mean, Anderson proved tonight that he can still compete at a high level, but I don't want him to compete. It's like, hey, what about Yoel Romero or what about Bohashinia? Like, nah. We're good. I mean, because there was that fear tonight. I mean, going in, that was part of the intrigue, so to speak, is like, what if Anderson just gets absolutely starched by this new version? So, Anderson doesn't have anything to prove. He really doesn't have anything to prove. So to me, it is more about interesting fights. And Nick Diaz is, what other fight makes sense for Nick Diaz? Another guy that's kind of advanced in his career, long layoff. So I actually like that fight a lot, to be honest with you. The Conor McGregor thing,
it's an interesting one, especially after a loss. Why Conor? And he's got Cerrone sort of in the wings there as well. I suppose to sort of, I don't know, he must be a fan, maybe grew up watching him.
I think if Conor McGregor was to beat Anderson Silva, even though Anderson's coming off a loss, given the size advantage, I think that would be massive for Conor. I don't think Anderson Silva coming off a loss is a bad thing, but I just have no interest in seeing that fight. Also because of the size advantage and because I want to see Conor sort of go back to trying to get that belt. I think like Luke Thomas has said in the past, it's exciting when they go for that belt, when they try and challenge it. And for him to take these fights that makes no sense in the division is just, I think, a bit of a waste of time.
That's the only reason why. Of course, it would be a big win for Conor McGregor. It would be cool. And don't get me wrong.
And he could lose as well. There's always the possibility of that, which is a huge loss.
If it got booked, I'm not saying I wouldn't tune in because the absurdity of it would be crazy. But think of it. The former featherweight champion against the former middleweight champion. Like,
we couldn't get GSP, a welterweight versus a middleweight. You're going to get a former featherweight against a middleweight?
And we've all stood next to these two guys. There is a massive size difference between those two. So I just think the Conor thing's silly. I like the Nick Diaz idea.
And also about Nick Diaz, if you look at his Instagram, I think he'd enjoy fighting at middleweight as opposed to welterweight these days. And also, you don't derail any other contenders. Nick Diaz is, I don't want to say he's irrelevant, but he's a legend and he's a fun fighter. And I think when you get two of these sort of older statesman guys, it works perfectly. What do you think, Oscar?
Yeah, so for me, the McGregor Silva thing, it's sort of like so out there. It's like taking a flamethrower to the place. It just gets a bit crazy. Yeah. But I think it's more, if the Cerrone fight wasn't there and wasn't obvious, and Ferguson and Khabib weren't like obviously going to fight, maybe you could be like, well, we've gone crazy with Mayweather. Let's go crazy with Silva. I mean, like John said, I'd probably watch it. It'd be crazy. But for me, I think Anderson now, the only fights he can take are fights with a story. He can't just like go, well, I'll fight a random top 5
Cannonier.
Yeah, Cannonier. I'll fight Cannonier in Brazil. Like, it needs to have a story. So the Nick Diaz one has a story. Weidman
a redemption story.
Yeah, well, Chris Weidman was a fight mentioned earlier in the press conference. That's got a story to it. Like, the both of them are weird little fights, I think a third fight with Chris could be fun and would have a story. Other than that, you alluded to it. It's not going to happen, but shit, if they can make that George St. Pierre fight, why not now? Like, if you're ever going to do it, you couldn't do it in their primes. This would be the second best time to do it. I just want to see Anderson in a fight with a story,
Obviously, some other wins on the card here from sort of fighters sort of getting out on the scene and making a name for themselves in the international market for the people that tuned into the pay-per-view and also to the card. John, a couple of sort of standout performances from you from the card in general, a couple of people that you think, some of the international people that are watching the show maybe who haven't seen the full fight card should maybe look out for in the future because there were a couple of really good wins here.
Have you heard of Jimmy Crute?
Name me one of his fights outside of the UFC. And we love Jimmy Crute. Of course, the mix-up, people thought that was me. That wasn't me. That wasn't me. I'm too old. I'm too sick.
No, look, Jimmy Crute did look fantastic. I will say this. I didn't agree with the stoppage. But the weird part is I almost wish that Mark Goddard would have stopped it when he first dropped Sam Alvey. Like, I thought that was the time to stop it. I thought at the moment that Mark did stop it, I thought Sam was covering up pretty well. And, I think was even giving a thumbs up or whatever. So I thought that was kind of a bad stoppage, but I still like the performance from Crute either way. So that was great. We did get to see Ricky Simone tonight, which is a name that most people probably didn't know. You know, it was weird that Simone and Yaya was like, you know, third on the card or what have you. But that is a guy that's an up-and-coming talent. We've seen him on the local scene in the States. He's somebody to pay attention to. And Devontae Smith, how good did he look? You know, Kai Kara France continues to impress. So this card was, like, I thought the card was entertaining overall. I enjoyed the night. As we said to start off, it just didn't have that pay-per-view feel. But there were, I thought, a lot of performances tonight that you could take away. Like, hey, that guy's fun to watch.
As we guys sort of wrap up, Oscar, before we let you go, first time in Australia, first time sort of spending a fight week here. Any key differences? Any highlights for you throughout the week?
I mean, the beer's exceptional. And so the women are nice too. The weather's good as well. You know, Melbourne has been a really fantastic city. It's been an absolute joy to be here. I love Australia. And as for covering fights here, I think Dana White mentioned at the press conference, there's an energy to Australia. You guys apparently just love punching each other. So you sort of get, it's contagious, right? Like all fight week, it's like one of those crowds like Toronto or New York where there's an energy. I think the fighters absolutely feed off it. I think there's a buzz around the city, man. And Dana White says that, you know, they could come here every weekend if he could. I wouldn't mind. It's cool. It's a good time.
John, any highlights?
Man, Rod Laver, yes, steaks were phenomenal. Yeah, you guys do steaks very well down here. As a Texas, some barbecue down here is actually pretty good too. But no, you know, honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about how great the atmosphere was for Whitaker Brunson. You know, I mean, we were in a lot of arenas, a lot of fights happened, that sort of thing. And I had kind of forgotten until we got down there. Rod Laver Arena is an awesome place. Like, it's one of the arenas that I actually kind of have on my list as, like, you know, if you're in the area. Like, I get everybody, you know, people coming to Australia probably think Sydney first or whatever. I think that's probably like the most famous Australian city, I would think. But Melbourne, man, it's incredible. And Rod Laver Arena, just the way it's set up, I think it's just the seating structure and the roof. I think, you know, sound just bounces off it or whatever. So to me, it's the atmosphere. Rod Laver Arena is a phenomenal place to watch a fight. It's up there with like HSBC in Rio when it's rocking. You know, the Bell Center in Montreal during like the GSP era. So that was great, man. I really love coming here for fights.
Well, as we say goodbye from the couch, it's been another fun event down here in Melbourne, Australia. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Have a great night, and thanks for checking out all our coverage. See you later.